Welcome to this episode of our podcast on Monarchy in Peril. I'm Robert Aldrich, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Sydney.
And I'm Cindy McCreary, an Associate Professor of History at the University of Sydney and Director of the Modern Monarchy in Global Perspective Research Hub.
In this episode, our theme is war. And war has been closely connected to monarchies throughout history and around the globe. Military action, the battlefield, and the spoils of war. Wars of conquest, wars of colonialism, wars of liberation. War creates particular challenges and crises for dynasties. Monarchs have always been associated with the military, and here we're going to focus on one particular period, and that is the First World War, the Great War of 1914 to 1918. By 1914, kings no longer led their forces onto the battlefield, as they had in the past, but they remained crucial in leading their countries, in boosting morale. To different degrees, they were involved in planning military strategy. The monarchs visited their armies on the front, giving out medals, and they and their consorts visited wounded soldiers in hospitals at home. They otherwise took part in the war effort.
Rather poignantly, royal family relationships were sorely tried during the First World War. And there were close family relationships between various monarchs. After all, Britain's King George V was the first cousin, and indeed a look-alike, of Russia's Tsar Nicholas II. Their mothers were sisters. Another cousin of George and Nicholas was the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. But of these three cousins, monarchs of three of arguably the most important kingdoms in Europe, Russia, Britain, and Germany, only George kept his throne by the end of the war. And by the end of the war, and the chaos and settlements that followed, the thrones of Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire had all toppled. And those countries became, at least in theory, republics. Most of the rulers and many of their family members fled into exile. But in the case of the Russian royals, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Tsarina Alexandra, and their 5 children were all murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1918.
For a closer look at monarchy during this period, we're joined by Moritz Sorg, who is a historian at the University of Freiburg in Germany. He has just completed a PhD thesis on foreignness and monarchic rule, the First World War and the crisis of transnational monarchy, 1914 to 1927. So he's a real specialist in this area. And thank you, Moritz, for joining us.
Thank you for having me on your podcast.
With the outbreak of war in August 1914, where did that leave the royal families of Europe, who were now separated by warfare and reigning over countries that were now enemies?
Royal families in Europe were surprised by the outbreak of the war in 1914. Many of them had been on summer holidays all over Europe at the time, visiting family, and now had to rush back when the war broke out. Because of the transnational interconnectedness and entanglement of European royal families, they had assumed that the family ties between the powerful European monarchs such as Wilhelm II in Germany, Tsar Nikolai in Russia, or George V in Great Britain would prevent the war in the end. But it didn't, and so this put many European royals in a very difficult position. Because of their transnational biographies, many kings and queens had not been born and raised in the countries they ruled, and so they found themselves in this very difficult position, and there were different setups why these people were not born in the country they ruled. So there were foreign queen consorts in many European countries because of the transnational marriage market of European royalty.
Can you give some examples?
Queen Elizabeth of Belgium, for example, as a Bavarian princess, was confronted with a German invasion of Belgium in 1914. On the other hand, there were also foreign princes, foreign monarchs in many European countries which had been found as new nation states in the 19th century. For example, the kings of Romania, Carol and Ferdinand, had not been born in Romania but were born and raised in Germany, and now confronted with mounting pressure to enter war on the side of the Entente and against their country of origin. So many royal figures in Europe were on the verge of finding themselves on enemy sides with their relatives abroad, but also with their countries of origin. Kings and queens had to decide if they wanted to stay in touch or break ties with their relatives on the enemy side.
Was the war considered a purely political conflict between countries, or was it also a personal conflict between royal dynasties?
When Prince Heinrich, the younger brother of Wilhelm II and cousin of George V, for example, left London in 1914, he still hoped and told George V that he hoped the war would not affect their personal friendship. However, the war turned out to be a very personal conflict between the British royal family and the German Hohenzollerns. His hopes did not come true here.
What was the particular situation faced by women royals?
Because of the gender ideals of the period, women were often pictured as apolitical. So the war was not considered their fault. They were not blamed for the war. And this made it much easier for them in many cases to maintain relations to relatives on the enemy side. However, wartime nationalism and xenophobic hysteria in warring countries forced many members of European royal families to publicly clarify their national self-understanding and also their relationships to their relatives abroad.
Did foreign-born kings and queens come under suspicion by local populations?
There were many rumors and suspicions about foreign-born kings and queens. These rumors threatened to destabilize the monarchies. Such rumors played a very important role in the fall of the Russian monarchy and the Russian Revolution, the collapse of the Habsburg dynasty, and also at the fall of other rulers at the end or during the First World War.
Now, Romania is a good example of transnational royal ties. Romania in southeastern Europe was a unified and independent kingdom from 1881. Its first king was Carol I, who was originally from the Prussian Hohenzollern dynasty in Germany. His successor, who reigned during the First World War, was King Ferdinand, and he was married to Marie. She was of German, Russian, and British royal ancestry.
During the phase of Romanian neutrality from 1914 to 1916, the Romanian king was suspected to keep Romania out of war against the national interests because of his German origins. And in Russia, the Tsarina Alexandra was suspected to conspire with her brother in Germany against Russia, and she and many other foreign-born consorts were accused of passing on military secrets to their relatives abroad. So these rumors and accusations were actually very serious threats to the legitimacy of European monarchies.
Moritz, can you tell us how the European royals tried to deal with all of those rumors and the suspicions that swirled around them?
In the beginning, most monarchies tried to censor or suppress rumors and accusations, but in no case this actually worked out, because these rumors were actually used by political interest groups as a tool against monarchy, against monarchs, and so they systematically supported and spread these rumors among the population. And in addition to that, neighboring countries with other censorship rules offered room for rumors to replicate, so it was impossible to efficiently suppress all these rumors. Therefore, monarchies had to develop counter narratives against the rumors, which inspired new strategies of legitimation, such as representative nationalization, the sharing of the hardships of the war with their subjects, being more approachable to their subjects, representing gender-specific ideals, or supporting democratic reforms.
Can you give some examples?
Belgian royal couple actually took decisive steps in the direction of a celebrity monarchy, which we know nowadays. Belgian propaganda had successfully pictured King Albert as a warrior king who stayed close to his troops in the trenches and personally interacted with them on a daily basis. Queen Elizabeth, his wife, was shown as a nurse or the mother of the wounded working in the Belgian hospitals. Their modesty and approachability were central values which resonated very well with the social developments during the war and in the time.
What about in the monarchies that were overthrown at the end of the war?
In Russia, in Austria-Hungary, or in Germany, the monarchies which toppled at the end of the war, we can find many failed attempts to implement such narratives, but because of structural obstacles, because of elite resistance or unfortunate coincidences, particularly because of a lack of authenticity, these strategies did not really have the effect which they had in other European monarchies.
Were the rumors and suspicions about the loyalty of European monarchs and their consorts justified?
In most cases, they were strongly exaggerated. European royals with transnational biographies turned out to be remarkably loyal to the countries they ruled. For example, King Ferdinand of Romania led his country into war against his country of origin, Germany, in 1916, and most queen consorts actually fully committed to war efforts as well. The case of the Greek Queen Sophie is maybe an exception. As a sister of the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, she actually passed on secret information to Germany, however, only during the Greek phase of neutrality.
Why did these monarchs remain so loyal to their kingdoms rather than their relatives?
There are two main reasons for this remarkable monarchical loyalty during the First World War. The first one is the contemporary explanation, which a lot of European royals actually used themselves. They highlighted their special sense of duty towards the nations they ruled, a kind of royal virtue. But on the other hand, and this I think is the stronger influence, is that they really feared that they would be overthrown if they did not pursue national interests in the war. And actually a lot of political figures threatened monarchs and queens with overthrowing them in that case. So in the end, I think it is a combination of monarchic values and an instinct of self-preservation, which actually led to this monarchic loyalty in the First World War. Nevertheless, I think the part of the rumors which is the most true is that a lot of royals, especially female royals, stayed in touch with some close relatives on the enemy side, despite the rumors and accusations. And for this, they used secret channels of communications, such as neutral embassies, neutral royals, or trusted envoys who traveled to neutral countries like Switzerland to pass on messages.
Many of the European monarchs and other royals were in a very awkward position from what you've said. They were loyal to their own countries, but they were still also trying to be loyal to their families in other countries who were on the other side of the battlefields, as it were. How did they try to support both their families and their countries?
I think the remaining family channels kings and queens used for secret exchanges in multiple situations. On the one hand, for humanitarian issues, so for example, for improving the conditions in prisoner of war camps, and on the other hand, peace negotiations or attempts for peace negotiations. They had some successes in the humanitarian area. The peace talks were actually never really successful. The reason for that was that European royals had to respect the public opinion by the time of the war. The decision power for foreign politics did not longer remain in the hands of the monarchs, but rather had passed to the hands of responsible governments or other political and military leaders. So they could not really decide on war and peace by themselves anymore. In addition to that, royal communication channels lost their confidentiality because of the rumors about these contacts. The peak of this process was actually the Sixtus affair in 1918, when the French government published a letter of the Austrian emperor to his brother-in-law, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, who was a paramedic in the Belgian army during the war. And in this letter, Emperor Karl had charged him with sounding out peace terms with the Entente. And the publication of this secret letter actually caused major scandal in Austria-Hungary and as well in Allied Germany, and further crippled the potential of these royal connections to lead to a peace during the war.
You're listening to Monarchy in Peril from the University of Sydney, and today's guest is Moritz Sorg.
Was there a sense of royal solidarity across enemy lines during the war?
A sense of royal solidarity was maintained during the First World War. So there was never a total war waged against enemy kings or queens. There were some incidents of shelling kings and queens who visited the front or the hinterland of the front, but they were never systematically targeted by the enemy side, which I think is, yes, an effect of this sense of royal solidarity which was maintained during the war. Revolutions in enemy monarchies, for example, were also never celebrated by royal families, but rather lamented. However, even allied royals such as George V in Great Britain were very reluctant to help the Romanov family after the revolution of 1917 because of the tense political situation at home. The murder of the Romanovs by the hand of the Bolsheviks in 1918 actually was a great shock to many European monarchs, which led to a renewal in attempts to secure the living conditions of the post-monarchs. So we can see that, for example, in the case of the surviving Romanovs who were helped more after the death of the Tsar and the Tsarina. We can see that in the example of Emperor Karl, or in the case of the Greek royal family after the Greek Revolution in 1923.
We know now that World War I was, in many ways, a watershed in human experience. Millions of people around the world were deeply affected by this conflict. How did the war experience of European royals affect these families in the post-war period?
The speed of rapprochement between royal relatives on enemy sides varied greatly after the end of the war. For example, in the case of George V, who immediately after the war wrote a letter to Ernst Ludwig of Hesse-Darmstadt and reinstated the connections to this part of his family. On the other hand, he never spoke again to the ex-emperor Wilhelm, who was now in exile in the Netherlands. But in general, we can see a tendency of slow re-internationalization among European royalty in the interwar period. Marriage patterns, for example, remained transnational, although there had been much discussion about actually nationalizing marriages during the war in almost every European monarchy. But particularly the younger monarchies saw royal exclusivity as a very important distinction and source of legitimation for themselves, especially in this phase of crisis for European monarchy. They just excluded German and Austrian princes and princesses from their royal marriage market because of the experiences and the hostilities of the war. Because of the still great hatred against former enemies in European societies, especially against Germany, European royal families had to be very careful when getting in contact again with their German relatives. So, for example, visits in Germany or German visits in former enemy countries remained impossible for a very long time.
There are some rather poignant cases of this, aren't there?
The Queen of Romania, Queen Mary, had to realize that when her mother died in 1920 and she could not attend the funeral in Coburg because the German authorities did not allow her to enter the country because of security issues. So they were afraid that the former enemy queen would be attacked by the German population. And also the Romanian government actually was very concerned which symbolic impression the visit of the Romanian queen in Germany that shortly after the war would have internationally. In this situation, Switzerland actually developed into a very important neutral ground on which royal families could meet in secrecy and reestablish their transnational bonds. However, this always fueled new suspicions against the transnational connections of European royals. And only in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, relationships towards Germany were slowly normalized, and so the German family ties of European royals lost much of their problematic character, just to be problematized again by the German aristocracy's alliance with the National Socialists or the Second World War, which came a few years later.
Thank you for those very interesting comments, Moritz.
Thank you for joining us for this podcast. Please join us next time when our theme will be Africa.
This series of podcasts has been created by the Modern Monarchy and Global Perspective Research Hub at the University of Sydney. Please see our website for further information at global-monarchy.sydney.edu.au. The texts of the podcasts were written by Associate Professor Cindy McCreary and Professor Emeritus Robert Aldrich, and the series was produced by Peter Adams from the University of Sydney School of Humanities. The podcasts are copyright by the University of Sydney, and the authors and interviewees retain rights to their material. We acknowledge the Indigenous Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which the University of Sydney stands.